Well, I mean, you know, that relates to the idea of these zones and the relationship with the hazard busing. I mean, I think that you know, most school systems will, you know, have the zone that says, you know, we're not going to pick kids up on the bus if they live within a mile, and parents, you know, much of the 30% jump is related to parents who live within that 1 mile zone. They still don't want their kids to walk, and they have no other option, right? And so they are often driving their kids to school very short distances. And then there are other parents who will drive their kids to school when they live outside of the zone. But if we can begin to address that challenge, which is the increase of the driving during those hours, we're going to be able to get better environmental outcomes and public health outcomes, you know, from the reduction of emissions and the connected increase in walking and biking. So when it comes down to it, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. If we can get some of those parents who live within the walking zone not to drive any longer and allow their kids to walk and bike, you know, it's something really achievable, actually.
Decrease congestion.
It would decrease congestion and get the outcomes that we're looking for, actually. We are in a different era as far as our kids walking to school. I mean, I don't think my parents would have waited until the next Thursday to make a decision whether to go find out where I was. But you know, the walking to school was, you know, just the rite of passage. You just walked, and I learned how to, you know, push the walk sign, and I learned how to run when the walk went to the flashing orange sign. And you know, on the other hand, we also learned the shortcuts. I mean, I think my walk to elementary school was walk down the street, cut through the high school, literally go through the high school building, walk on the high school track, walk through a hole in a fence, through an apartment complex, through a parking lot, and then through another hole of a fence, and then I was at my elementary school. And that's how I got to school. And right now, the distance that my kids have to travel is probably the same amount that I traveled when I was in elementary school, but we don't let them go because of this one road that is particularly dangerous, and except when we do a walking school bus. And so they get picked up by the bus. And the amount of time that it takes for them to wait for the bus to come, get on the bus, take the bus route, go all the way to school is more than it would take for them to walk. It's just, we don't let them walk because of that one street. They're not getting the physical activity, yeah. Well, I think there's a number of things, a number of parts or answers to that question. I mean, I think first, if you think about what's gone on with schools, with the disinvestment in the older schools, a building that was built in 1913 or 1920, this wasn't, you know, in communities across the country, this is not just happening with school buildings. It's happening in, you know, in manufacturing jobs leaving, in the abandonment of warehouse buildings or other types of buildings in older communities. And, you know, and that space, those spaces which are not being used anymore are being replaced by other spaces. You know, a factory being built out on the edge, new office buildings being built out on the edge, infrastructure spending that had previously been spent in an existing older community now being spent in the suburbs or the exurbs further and further out. So it's not just about schools. It's happened, you know, in a variety of institutions that we spend our money on. And the consequences of that is that, you know, you know, we're passing up on the ability to take advantage of previous investments that we've made. So if we just think about schools, you know, our grandparents paid for the school that was built in 1920 or 1930. And that investment is still there on the ground. And then when we abandon that and we have to replace that investment, we have to start all over again. So there is an imperative, I think, for us to think about what we've spent in previous generations and how we can take advantage of that so it'll cost us less. So when it comes to historic preservation of school buildings, one, even though the expense of rehabilitating an older school and bringing it up to speed as far as like the technology that needs to be there and the new pipes and things like that, I think for the most part is going to be less than the cost of a new school if you're just talking about the building. But then when you talk about not only the building but the infrastructure to serve that building, which the expense is going to be lower all told. The problem is when it comes to a new school, some of the new roads that need to be built or the sidewalks that need to be built or the pipes that need to be put in on the new school are not part of the calculation that a school system takes into account when they create the new one. Yet the community somehow has to pay for the widening of the road and such. So I think that I guess the other consequence, the other big picture consequence is that many of our older communities have lost population, and many schools don't have the population they need to keep the school open. So the issue is, how do we repurpose that school for another use? But note that over time, we may want to go back to using that as a school. And I think there are a number of organizations, one of which is the Center for Cities and Schools, which is at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. They've looked into the idea, some of these sort of other ideas. How do you repurpose a school, but then, continue to use it as a school when it needs to be used later on? And I think that's the challenge. You don't want the building to be torn down like you saw in some of those slides, but you want it to be used for something else, community center, even offices. In some places, some of the schools are being used as apartments or lofts and things like that. It's going to be harder to repurpose them back to a school later, but at least the building is not going to be lost. Post-World War II, I think there was an emphasis on building bigger schools, consolidating schools, having less administrators per student. So, the idea of bigger schools sort of came along at that point. Then the idea of making sure that all the athletic facilities could be there. There's a good amount of discussion over schools being built on one story, so that you needed more land, so they spread out a little bit. At the same time, there were a number of organizations sort of advocating for, well, if you're going to build a new school, let's make sure that the site that it's built on is large, right? And that led to these sort of recommended guidelines for school site size. And as they started to get into the 10, 15 acre for elementary school plus another acre for every 100 students, the availability of these types of sites were most likely to be out on the edge of a community, right? So you need a bigger site because you need to have a bigger school. You're going to have to build it further and further out, right? So as that was occurring, as the search for new sites was occurring in larger sites, there was also other policies that were going on in many communities across the country with road building, with the idea of providing infrastructure further and further out, with population moving from urban centers to more suburban centers. So all of these sort of things aligned to the point where the status quo became, the default setting became, build a new school, build on a bigger site out on the edge. And in some cases, those were being built because residential growth was going out there, and in some cases those were being built in a way that attracted residential growth, and that's sort of how we got to where we are. When you build on bigger sites, when you build further and further out, when the acreage size or the site size for a typical residence goes from a small, maybe a third of an acre or an eighth of an acre to larger and larger sites, walking in general, whether it's to school or not, is discouraged or is not possible. I mean, many of us will walk just for exercise, but for the most part, the way you're going to get daily physical activity is if you walk for a purpose. You walk to the grocery store, you walk to the school, you walk to your church or your synagogue and that sort of thing. Yeah.